everybody, welcome back to the first part in a mini-series I'm going to be doing for my channel. And this series is going to be all about intervals, arpeggios, and chords, or chord construction, let's call it. In this first part, I'm going to be talking and diving in depth, talking about something that I feel is one of the most important things for a guitar player to learn, to really learn to navigate his instrument in a way that's going to be useful and in a way that's going to be different than maybe the standard way a lot of folks approach it, which is just learn scales, right? And maybe improvise using nothing but sort of thinking about scale patterns, which can work, but can also limit us at the same time. So intervals is a really important topic to discuss and to really master as a guitar player. It's going to really open a lot of doors for us, okay? Now, a lot of folks might ask, you know, they may not even be looking to learn this or feel they should put the effort into it or watch a video like this if they don't really understand what the purpose of learning these intervals would be. We'll talk about what interval is in a moment, but I think it's really important because it allows us to do a number of things. One thing being to visualize our fretboard in a very different manner than maybe we're used to doing if all we've ever done is just learn scales before. It's going to allow us to be able to build any chord that we see the name of presented to us or that we can think of, or even, maybe just come across a new chord shape we've never seen and be able to figure out what the name of that chord is. We will also need some other knowledge to go along with just the intervals, but it's one of those things that it will eventually allow us to do if we have good knowledge of intervals and those patterns on our fretboard. It'll also give us a really refreshing new way to play lead guitar and come up with new musical ideas, whether we're composing, whether we're improvising, whether we're just trying to break out of ruts. It's a really handy bit of knowledge to have a really good grasp of these intervals. So I keep saying intervals, but what are intervals, right? An interval is basically a different way to say the space or the distance between two notes on our guitar or in music in general. Guitar is very unique that it's a very pattern or shape-oriented instrument, and that really gives us an advantage over some other instruments in being able to memorize these intervals very easily. Now you might say, what do you mean by the distance between two notes? Well, a lot of us folks have learned scales in the past. I have a bunch of lessons up on my channel, and there's a couple things I would like everybody to do before maybe going into this video deeply would be, or after watching this, is to go back and check out. I did a couple videos. One was called Mastering the Fretboard. And I really talked about a lot of concepts that I use and that I would teach to folks to really get to know their fretboard well. And it was using octave shapes and using the idea that the guitar is tuned in a certain way where notes repeat themselves. I don't want to get too in depth here with that, but go back and watch that video and it'll help you to understand a lot about what we're going to be talking about today. I also did some talking about scales and modes, which I have more coming up in that series. I just have to find more hours in the day to get to them. But those are also going to be very handy to understand a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about here. A lot of folks already know that stuff, and then just carry on with this and you'll understand a lot of what I'm talking about. But basically, intervals come from the major scale. So the major scale on our guitar is one that's very recognizable. A lot of folks, even if they don't have knowledge of music or guitar or any other instrument, still can recognize this little pattern. Right? The, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do pattern that we probably all learned in primary school music classes. Well, that's a very important sequence of notes because that's where our intervals come from. Now, in music theory, there's all sorts of rules as far as intervals, right? We have our major scale, and basically if I just count up the notes, for instance, I'm starting in A here on A major. If I count up the notes, let's say 1, 2, 3, well, I land on what we call a third, right? So playing that with the root note I started on, in this case A, playing those together gives me an interval of what we call a major third. Well, there's all sorts of rules following intervals, that if we take a major interval and we, move it back one fret, so here's a major interval, Notice the root note stayed the same, but I moved that interval back a fret. Now it becomes a minor third. Okay, so a major interval, when we move it back, becomes a minor interval. You know, if I just simply went 1, 2, well, that's an interval of a major second. You know, we can also place that note here. Pretty dissonant interval when played together with an overdriven tone, but that's an interval of a major second. If I move that interval back 1 fret, we now have an interval of a minor second, right? So we also have other types of intervals where if I went to the 4th or the 5th, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's a perfect 4th, you know. If I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's a perfect 5th, right? And then if we make a perfect interval, you know, flat or move down 1 fret, it becomes a diminished interval. Well, there's a lot to that. No, I really think that's good information to have, but I don't want to approach it that way for this video. I want to talk about kind of the way that I view things, and it's just with the numbers and talking about whether it's just sort of a natural number, meaning just the number. So in the case of a third, you know, 1, 2, 3, that would be an interval of a third. We won't call it a major third for now, even though it is that. And then if we were to move that to a minor third, I just refer to it as a flat third, right? So that's a third, that's a flat third. And we'll look at diagrams for these as far as memorizing very shortly. So I want to think in terms of, you know, just a number and either whether it's going to be sharp or flat. So if I have an interval of a fourth, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I want to make that a sharp fourth, I would simply move it up. Even though normally that might be called an augmented, you know? So, but we won't get into that. I want to keep things simple to allow us to not get so hung up on memorizing terms that may or may not mean anything to us, and more about making it really useful for us on the guitar, okay? So let me sort of start this off by giving an example of something a lot of folks are very familiar with, especially rock guitar players. We're very familiar with the almighty power chord, right? Everybody knows that, right? And we hear so many songs. You know, there's so many songs written with those power chords just moving around, and a lot of classic riffs, and so many great pieces of music written using those. And what we don't realize, a lot of people call them power chords, but they're not actually chords at all. You know, the actual definition of a chord is needing 3 or more notes played at the same time. And that is just 2 notes. So what that actually is an interval. And a lot of folks that have, you know, looked through guitar music or guitar magazines will have oftentimes seen, you know, the root note, A, let's say, or B, and then a number 5 beside it. And we recognize that as, oh, that's a power chord. Well, what it actually is just a 5th interval, or a perfect 5th interval. And the reason we get that is if we go back to the major scale and count through the notes. Here's my root note. Again, I'm just starting on A. We could start this on any note. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we end right there. If we put those 2 notes together, we end up with a perfect 5th interval, which we kind of water down or dumb down to being a power chord, right? And it's an extremely useful musical tool. Well, I don't think you're going to get too many arguments from anybody that if you said, you know, a power chord's a pretty simple thing to do. It's one of the first things a lot of us learn as guitar players, and you know, it's easy to do, it's easy to remember. It's this shape, you know, kind of, we hold our hands up with our 1st and 3rd finger, we can just move that all over the place. Right? Doesn't matter where we put it, it just works. Well, what if we memorized every other interval shape sort of in the same fashion that we've memorized power chords, right? Or the power chord shape, so that we could effortlessly kind of access it whenever we wanted to, whenever we needed it. Now you might say, well, what do I need it for? Well, what if we want to build a chord? And in a future lesson in this series, I'll talk about how we can just sort of spell the chords out with intervals and get to know any chord that's thrown at us by name. And it's something that's very simple to do. But what if we knew all those intervals? We would be able to not only spark new musical ideas, but build other chords, access this knowledge while we're improvising to come up with newer and maybe more interesting ideas, or different ideas than what we normally would have, okay? So let's take a look at this and see how simple it is to memorize all these intervallic shapes that we're going to need to do all these things I've described. And I hope I've been kind of clear about that. So obviously we have in the major scale, if we count through the notes, we have 7 different notes. We start on the root note, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now you could say, well, that's 8. Yes, it's 8, but that is what we call an octave. Oct meaning 8, right? We've moved 8 notes through the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we're back to the start. So there's really only 7 different notes. Now, as we spread them over octaves, we may name the intervals different. We'll talk about that shortly. So really, we just have to tackle 7 patterns, really, and memorize 7 shapes to give us the ability to access all the intervals, okay? So I'm going to have some diagrams up on the screen as I go through these, and we'll sort of see, come up with a method to being able to memorize these. Now, there's going to be slightly more than 7 shapes just because there could be multiple shapes we have to remember for each interval, okay? And we'll talk about that now. So, first interval we're going to talk about is the second, which we would know as the major second, with the proper term coming from the major scale. Now, I always like to think if my root note's going to be here on A, I always like to think of intervals as either falling kind of, you know, in front or behind our root note. And another way is to be horizontal, meaning it's going to be on the same string. So one way to look at a second interval would just be knowing that if anywhere I am, if I go simply 2 frets above the note I'm on, I'm playing an interval of a major second, or a second in our case. If I want to make that a flat second, I just move it back a fret, right? So this would be the interval of a major second. This would be an interval of a minor second or a flat second. All right? So we can also move that, so we have the horizontal version, but that kind of paints us into a bit of a corner because it's on the same string, right? If we want to use that playing the notes at the same time, it's going to be difficult to do so because they're taking up the same string. So in that Mastering the Fretboard video I mentioned that I did a long time ago, I talked about, you know, using this kind of 5th fret method of the guitar tuning to know that, you know, the same note lies in many places. So we know that this note at the 7th fret would also lie back here. So this shape here, where I would have my root note, let's say at the 5th fret on the 6th string, 1, 2, 3 frets back from that 5th string 2nd fret would also be this second interval. Sounds kind of dissonant with some overdrive, but it's still useful, right? So right away, just like we would think of a power chord as being this, we can think of a second interval as being this. And let's stop thinking of a power chord as a power chord. Let's think of it as a 5th interval. That's always a 5th. That's always a second interval. Okay, but now the thing is, we may not always want it so close to our root note. So going back to the Mastering the Fretboard video I did, we talked about an octave pattern, okay? And we mentioned that using octaves, which is just another interval pattern, right? So if you take a 5th interval and keep your root note where it is and move your 3rd finger down to the 4th string in this case, that now just becomes an octave, right? So that gives us a very easy way. Go back and watch that video where I explain that a lot more. I won't get too much into the octave thing here. I've already talked about that. But what we can do is if this is our second interval, well, I could just go an octave up from my second interval to find the same note and find that if I go back to my root note of A here, this little pattern here, and you'll see the diagram on the screen if you can't tell what I'm doing here, this is also a second interval. It's an octave higher though. Now sometimes when we're building chords and talking intervals, we do go beyond the octave. So we sometimes, depending on the chord that we're building, and again, we'll talk about this at a later episode, we may have to refer to that as something other than a second. In this case, we're going to add 7 to it. We're going to refer to it as a 9. Okay? So anytime we add 7 to an interval number, we end up with the same interval 1 octave higher, if that makes sense. So a 2 would be the same as a 9. A 3rd interval would be the same as a 10th interval, which you don't hear spoken about too often. There's good reason for that. A 4th would be the same as an 11th. A 5th would be the same as a 12th. A 6th would be the same as a 13th. Okay? So here we would have a second interval and another second interval, or a 9th interval if we wanted to discuss it like that. We could also move that up another fret and even have this here. Now the only thing is, if our root note is anywhere but on the 6th string, this isn't really going to be a viable option. But these two will. And this is the beauty of this. When we move intervals, even if our root note isn't on the same string, a lot of the intervals shapes don't change. There is one exception to that, or a couple exceptions we'll talk about in a minute. So if my root note was actually here on D, right, on the 5th string, now my interval doesn't change. If I want a major second away from this, I just go to that same shape. So we don't need to know that this is D and this is E, even though that's helpful. We just have to know that shape, just like the power chord. This was a 5th, this was a 5th. This is a 2nd, right? Even though it doesn't sound that great, it's still a 2nd, right? So there is one exception to that we'll talk about in a moment when we get involved with the 2nd string, okay? So this would be a 2nd, this would be a 2nd, this would be a 2nd. Wonderful, great. So this is really easy once we learn these patterns. So let's move on. What about a 3rd interval? Well, 1, 2, 3. The building block of a major chord, right? The major 3rd interval. Well, again, we can move that up an octave. We find that this is also a major interval, right? So, or a major 3rd interval. 3rd, 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 3rd. Always, always, always. If you notice, I'm just muting the other strings and I'm only playing those 2 notes. Okay, it's always going to be a major third interval based off of the root. So in this case, that would be a big building block of the A major chord. I have A here. I don't need to know that that's a C sharp note, although it's a good idea. It's still just a major 3rd. We could also expand that way out if you wanted to, up to here. We've also got the sort of horizontal version of it, okay? Which will help us later when we start talking about arpeggios. So this shape here, 3rd and 3rd, and our horizontal 3rd. Let's move on to the 4th. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the 4th is just going to be almost like a little bar here. And then we can move that up an octave as well. This will also be a 4th interval. Okay, so 4th and 4th. We move on to our almighty power chord. There it is. So there's our 5th interval. Now, the only thing is, this could also be done back here. So remember I was mentioning we can have some situations where we have the interval in front and also behind our root note. A lot of people don't ever think of playing a power chord like this by muting this string in between. You might say, well, why would I do that? Well, what if we want to add more intervals to it? You know, we figured out that this was a 2nd interval and a 9th is also up here, another 2nd. Well, what if I wanted to do, you know, the 1, the 5, and the 2 together to make kind of a sus2 kind of a chord? Could also play it up here. And again, because I have moved the 2nd up the 5 frets, do you see how it starts giving us ways to visualize shapes and create new chords very effortlessly and quickly? I could also say, well, I know that, you know, taking the 2nd and moving that up to a 3rd. Do you see how I'm visualizing the shapes now of the intervals and easily able to create new and interesting chord shapes that maybe I wouldn't have known. So far, we have our 2nd interval. Sorry, that's the 5th. 2nd, 2nd, 2nd. 3rd, 3rd, right? 4th, right there. Now 5th. And then also this one here, that's kind of between our 6th string and our 2nd string. That would also be a 5th interval. We move to our 6th interval. So I'm on skipping a string, 1 fret back, kind of a diagonal line as you'll see on the diagram. So that's a 6th, and this would also be a 6th. Okay, an octave higher, so 6th and 6th. We also have a 6th up here as well. The more places we can locate it, the easier it's going to be. And that's a really common thing in these old blues riffs, right? right? From a 5th chord to a 6th. All right, so we start to see where these things have been used throughout time in some pretty common musical examples, right? So 6th and 6th interval. We move on to the 7th interval. The building block of major 7th chords along with a major 3rd, right? So all of a sudden I go, well, here's a major 3rd and here's a major 7th. I'm starting to visualize and see how these chords can be used to build different things, right? There's a major 3rd, there's a 7th. There's a 5th. Starting to use it to build chords. And again, we'll talk about that much later in the future. So we've got a 7th here. We've also got a 7th way up here, okay? The other place a 7th always lies is in a horizontal type movement, is 1 fret back from the root note. So if this is my root note, I know if I move back 1 fret, from there is a major 7th, okay? So I've got this one and that one. And I could also even just go up an octave here if I really wanted using that octave pattern. So I'm going through this kind of quick, but I hope you guys can see the patterns on the screen. I'm going to help you. All of this material will be available on my website as a download package if you want to go grab that, just so you can have it, or you can just use it here from this video, okay? And then we've covered all the intervals, right? We moved then to an octave pattern, which is one that I talked about before in that Mastering the Fretboard series, lesson series. Okay, so that's all of our intervals. Now, like we said before, we can have flat intervals and sharp intervals. So what if somebody said, well, we need a flat 7th? Well, we just simply go to our 7th interval and we make it flat, right? It's that simple, okay? So that would be, you know, there, or there, or there in the case of the 7th. If it was a 6th, well, if that's our 6th interval, we know that's our flat 6th. May not be something we want to hear, but that is what it is, right? Or right there, kind of a dissonant interval as well. So if we memorize all of those patterns, as well, I'll go back to the example, as well as we know, you know, the trusty old power chord, it's going to open up a lot of possibilities for us as far as playing leads, playing arpeggios, creating new chords, figuring out what, you know, chords that maybe we're already playing, how they're named and what they are, and how they fall into sort of music theory. You know, so just knowing this, if I know that, you know, a major 7th arpeggio is going to be a 1, a 3, a 5, and a 7, I would simply start here, go, well, I know that that's a 3, I know that that's 5, and I know that that's a 7. And then the octave is right there. Or I could do the 3 up here. Another 7 there. So it opens up a lot of possibilities into our visualization of the fretboard. Now what happens though as we move around the fretboard? Well, the guitar is tuned in a very interesting manner. The guitar is tuned in fourths for the most part, right? So moving from, you know, E to A, right? E to A. Well, if we notice that, that is that interval of a perfect fourth we talked about. You know, A to D, same thing, perfect fourth. G to B, D to G, perfect fourth. Problem is when we go from G to B, now we're now dealing with the interval of a major third. So between those two strings, we're always going to be dealing with a major third. And then we go back to a perfect fourth from B to E, but that kind of throws things out of kilter a little bit. So to compensate for that, whatever pattern we learned, let's say for instance, this major third interval that I showed you a few moments ago, if I was to move this straight down, that's no longer a major third if my root note starts on the 5th fret, okay? A power chord, right, if I was here, I keep moving it down until I get to this string, all of a sudden that's not a 5th interval anymore. So any interval that comes in that we already know that we move up to incorporating the 2nd string into it, we have to compensate by moving that up 1 fret because All the other strings are perfect fourths. It's a major third. We need to compensate by shifting it up 1 fret, okay? So for instance, if I was to take this as my major third and I move that I want this to be my root note now, and I have my little shape, I simply just move it up a fret, and that's going to be a major third. This would actually be a minor third or a flat third. We can hear it just by ear. There's that sad minor sound. There's that happy major sound, right? So this now would be our major third, right? Also, if we keep going up where I'm using the root note on the 4th string, that would also be my major third, right? I have to move up. And the reason is, you know, the 1st string is a 4th away from the B, but we had to compensate by moving this up, so everything else beyond that also has to be shifted up, if that makes sense, okay? So the thing to remember is, as we go, if we're on a root 6th interval, right? So let's take this as a root 6th, where the root note is on A, and I'm doing a major 6th interval. If I move that up, I'm not incorporating this string into it yet, so that still is just a 6th interval, right? No big deal with that. And that would be a 6th interval as well up there, because that's an octave above that, right? So as soon as I start maybe doing something like a 3rd or a 4th, right? So here's a 4th and here's a 4th. So if I move up to my root note being on the 5th string, that's a 4th, but that's got to be compensated on the 2nd string by moving up, okay, to a 4th up here, instead of a 4th with the root note on the 6th string, if that makes sense, okay? The best way, I mean, that's a good explanation for it because of the tuning of the guitar, but the best way is to just go through and memorize the shapes as they are, right? So that we don't think about it. We want to be able to access this stuff without any thought involved, okay? But just always keep in mind that tuning discrepancy and know that if you know a shape, you know, from let's say the 6th root or the 5th root, and then all of a sudden we're incorporating the 2nd string into it, that's got to be shifted up a fret to compensate. Much like with the power chord. It's a good example again. 5th interval, power chord, power chord. Here, that's a power chord now. We go back up here, because my root note is on the 2nd string, that's back to the tunings of a 4th, so that's a shape. So I'm gonna have all those shapes available for you if you want to take a look at them anyway, so we're gonna understand them. The other one is that, what if we're using an open string as our root note, right? Well, the way I like to look at this is by sliding things around. So let's take a power chord again. If I keep sliding this backwards, now obviously this is silly. I don't need to be fretting this note. It's an open string. So if I remove that, there's my 5th interval. It's the same shape. It's just there's no need for this finger, so I can simply do this if I wanted to with 1 finger. That's still a 5th interval. Obviously, we're not going to be able to get intervals like this, which is a 3rd, because if I move this back, well, we run out of frets, right? But the 3rd that I was talking about here, you know, again, if we just move that back, we end up not needing this. So from the open E to this G sharp up here, in this kind of shape, in the same way we have a line drawn between it like I showed in some of the diagrams, it's still going to be a 3rd. But we just have to get our head around the shapes. That's why I say the shapes are so important, right? So many great things hidden within this. So what I would really recommend is just going through and saying, okay, I'm going to, you know, today I'm going to get to know my 2nd intervals everywhere. Get to know that as a shape. Get to know this, even though it just doesn't seem like anything, it's still a shape we should know. There's our 2nd interval. Maybe the next day we come back and we say, I'm going to just focus on the 3rd interval today. If you want to go up that far. Then do it, you know, go through all your intervals. 4ths, 5ths, 6ths, right? 7ths, and then octaves as well. Also practicing on different root notes, right? So now if I'm on root 5th, You know, second is the same shape as this one, but up here, because we're incorporating the second string, that's going to be my second now, right? Third, fourth, fifth, right? And so on and so forth. We'll just keep kind of working our way up until we get comfortable with all those shapes and patterns, starting with the root on the fourth string, right? That's still going to be a third, as is that, right? That's going to be a second, as is that. And knowing those so that we can access them at will is going to allow us to be able to do a lot of things in the future. So this lesson was just about getting to know those patterns so that then we can apply them to different things in the coming lessons, which are going to be chord construction and arpeggio playing, and then talking about how we can incorporate that into playing much more interesting lead ideas, covering a lot more ground in our lead playing, but also even giving us the ability to use them as compositional tools, right? Where we can come up with, break out of ruts, doing things that, you know, we never would have thought of before because we have a new way of visualizing things. And you'll see when you start playing little arpeggios, you'll start to see how these intervals, like little chords we know, like a little A major like this, you know, you all of a sudden start seeing, oh, there's a major third interval. You go, oh, there's a fifth interval, right? It's from there. So well, where's the seventh? Well, that's right there. Right, so you're going to start to be able to visualize things in a very interesting way once we get those under our fingers. And it's a lot easier than you might think. If you just take it a step at a time, grab one interval at a time, really internalize them to the point where we're going to be able to know where they are effortlessly, it's going to add a lot of possibilities. So I will be back soon. I hope that was clear. I hope I explained it well. If not, you know, rewind or send me a question. And I'll do my best to answer it. I'll have the link below where the materials for this will be available on my website as a download package. You can grab that from the store there. And just so you have hard copies of it that you can print out, you know, it might be a useful thing to have as a reference, right? I'll also have them, like I said, in this video. But I hope you guys enjoyed that. Please spend some time with that, and I'll be back soon with part 2 of this, where we start to discuss how we can use these as arpeggios will be the next topic of conversation. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Really appreciate your time, and I hope you got something out of that. And if you did, please like the video, share it if you don't mind, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'll be back soon with some more content. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Ciao for now.